Okay, well this detent spring for the blade actuating ring hooks against a stud there on the blade actuating ring. First I'll get the blade actuating ring in place, seated. And then swing that spring into place. Oops. That's right there. It's against that stud. I'll put the lens tube on in place. It only goes on in one orientation, so you can't make a mess of that. Just checking there's nothing trapped underneath the under it. That all looks good. There are 3 screws, 2 shorter ones and 1 longer one. The longer one goes through the bracket as well, so make sure the 2 shorter ones go in the other positions. And if you mess that up, you'll end up with screws sticking out where they shouldn't do, and they catch on the shutter blades. But a more serious problem is that if you haven't got the longer screw going through this bracket, the screw won't be engaging all the way through the mechanism plate, so it's only engaging a very small number of threads, perhaps 1 instead of 2. And as a result, when you tighten it up, it's much more likely to strip. Just checking the motion of this, and it moves smoothly enough. Just blow off any stray threads of cotton that might be sitting on it. And this I'll lubricate with some graphite powder. And the detent spring I'll lubricate later with some molybdenum paste. So I'll pop that to one side. Blades next. I'll clean these shutter blades. Same deal, naphtha, cotton buds. Of course I haven't got the pivots, the rivets to worry about. The shutter blades are much easier to deal with in that regard. What I'm trying to do here is remove any traces of oil from the blades, because the oil is very efficient at sticking the blades together. If they're particularly oily, you may have to go over them all twice to be confident that you've dealt with it. Check these blades and see they're not seriously marked. The marks on the blades vary from leftovers from the oil, basically a lacquer sort of effect from dried out oils, or they can be scratches on the blades, or they can be light corrosion if the camera's been subject to any moisture, any humidity over time. That can leave slight corrosion on the blades. But in this case the blades are in good order. There are a few slight marks on those blades perhaps, but nothing to worry about. If there's corrosion on the blades are a little bit rough, then yes, I would polish those with brasso. Get the blades nice and nice and shiny again. Okay, so that's all pretty good. Now this business here, the mechanism plate, I was going to lubricate that with a bit of graphite powder. I've got some here loose in this container. What I'm going to do is just dot a bit of graphite powder in around there and just work that backwards and forwards. Knock off the excess and go and blow that out of the way. Right, that's all clean. I'll just move this into the blade open position. And start fitting the shutter blades in place. That's blade number 1 position there. Shutter blades, unlike diaphragm blades, are just lay one on top of the other. So there is a first blade and a last blade. Okay, they're all in place, and I can put the case on the top now, which will hold all this together. It only goes on one way, and I can tell it goes on right there. So just like putting the diaphragm blades in, I run this case screws down very lightly until I've checked that the blades have remained where I left them. Nothing jumped out of position and that everything moves smoothly. That looks good, so I can tighten those 3 case screws. That's great. Right, a little bit of molybdenum paste. That detent spring, I need to get some on there. And at 2 points here on the blade actuating ring where it picks up the main cam. And that's sticking down for some reason. I've got to figure out what's going on there. One of those 2 points should just pop up, but it's not. Something. Yeah, the connection on this side. That's spring loaded. It should just pop straight up into position, but it seems to be sticking. Keep an eye on that, make sure that's not causing any problems. It's all right now. Okay, so that's our blades back in the shutter, all nice and clean. That detent spring does its job. You can say it biases the blades to the closed position, so it tends to force them closed or force them open, if you like. And the diaphragm blades are nice and smooth. Start putting the other stuff back into the shutter, all the springs and wheels and so forth. Start reassembling the components onto the mechanism plate, and I start with the springs. And springs are difficult to deal with without dropping them or having them flick off into outer space. So this one in particular, always hold a toothpick or something over the shaft so that the spring can't get away if it pings off out of my tweezers. Just checking that's seated correctly and both of those levers move smoothly. This is a very pointy pair of tweezers I use just about exclusively for dealing with these springs. And I have to say I'm not that proficient with them because I haven't had them very long, and every pair of tweezers feels different. Okay, so that spring's there. I need to get the B lever in position, so I will hold back this tab, slide the blade actuating ring forward, which brings the blade actuating ring round to the point where the B lever can drop right in towards the centre. I've got to hook this B lever behind its return spring. It's a little notch on the back of the B lever. I've got to engage with that spring, slide it back, get it over its post, and there it is seated. The screw that holds the B lever in position also has a spring on it, and this spring is the return spring for the flash sync setting lever, self-timer setting lever. So I've got to get the screw in there. Of course the spring wants to get in the way because nothing's ever that simple. To get that screw started, run down, check that the lever moves freely, tighten that screw up. Now this spring needs to be swung round so that this is pressing against the inside, against the lens tube, and the other end of it's tucked behind this lever here. That looks good. That's all as it should be. If I hold back the B lever with my finger, I can pull the blade actuating ring back to the parked position. Easy. So the pallet wheel can go on next. And then there's the sector gear that drives the pallet wheel, and this piece I'm just going to put a touch of molybdenum paste on the little catch on the end. Yeah, usually just put this into place. Goes over its post there, engages with the pallet wheel. If I hold back that catch, I can drop it into position, and its return spring is here, and I will need my pliers to get onto that. Well, it's late in the day and the sun has come around, and I'm going to have to close that curtain because the contrast will be too high. Right, so I've got my spring, hook it over its post there, stretch it out, drop it into place. It's all moving nicely. I can put these pieces back in place. If I just clean them first, because everything here is a bit sticky with dirty grease. The setting lever here, that's quite grimy. You can see there's a lot of staining there. That's some dirty oil or grease on the back of that. Yeah, it's quite black there, but it's a mixture of grease and dust really. I want all that filth off there, otherwise the aperture settings just won't work smoothly. Yeah, it's a real mixture, this camera. Some parts are very clean, other parts are very dirty. Yeah, this lever is not sitting at 90 degrees, so I'll see if I can square that up. Oh, it's miles away. That's better. And this piece, this shim, this should be nice and clean. These are very broad flat surfaces and quite shiny with it, so if there's oil or grease on them there, they do not move freely. There's too much shear required to get them to shift. You can see the filth coming off there. This could be lubricated with a bit of graphite. You can, if you've got a soft lead pencil, you can run that over these parts, and that will provide ideal lubrication for things like this. And the screws, well, the screw heads should be clean. I can see that there's some rubbish on them. If they're sticky enough, they'll stop that lever from moving smoothly. They'll be okay. Pop those to one side. Bring back the shutter. And a wipe of molybdenum paste on this detent spring here. That's where the setting lever sits. There's like little ratchet teeth on this piece here. I'll just give that a wipe. And that will do. So let's set this in position. I'm going to make sure that the post hooks behind the spring here, that wire spring. That's good. Take my shim. It only fits on here in one direction. Little notch in the case and the tab on that shim sits into it. The aperture setting lever goes on, and those two knobs are fairly close together there, and put the fixing screws in place. And then check the action to make sure that the aperture moves smoothly. If there's distortion in that lever, that ring, the settings won't move smoothly. And that's not uncommon, because if people have been somewhat heavy-handed changing the aperture, they can distort things, and you get stuff rubbing. This stuff shouldn't be rubbing. I think that over time we've become complacent with cameras, and we expect them to be robust. It's just another tool in the toolbox, whereas once upon a time they were regarded as delicate instruments and treated as such. Okay, so I'm just checking the motion there, and that's nice and smooth. So the aperture settings is good, that's nice and free. Alright, let's carry on. Get the rest of this flash sink stuff back in place. I'll just put a wipe of molybdenum paste through the centre of that tab. That's sprung loaded. You've got to hook this into place to get that spring on the inside of the case. Swing that lever across, drop it in, check that the spring's not pointing up in the sky or sticking straight down, and it's all good. Here's our moving flash contact. Get that into place. I'll just cock this, it latches into position. Then this cover goes on. This cover's also got, this piece forms a latch which will hold the the main cam in position. Just hold it in the cocked position. Plain screw at this end. A return spring and a shouldered screw at this end. You need to make sure that the spring can move freely around that shoulder, that it doesn't get trapped underneath it. That's good. Lift those two screws up. The spring has to be hooked up around the back of this lever now, so I've got to lift that into position. There's a notch in the back of this lever that spring catches into. That's moving well. That's good. Now the shutter release lever can go in place. I'll just put a quick wipe of molybdenum paste on there, and a quick wipe under there where it'll pick up the B lever. So it's got to go under the B lever here, and the spring gets tucked up inside the case. That's our shutter release. So when you cock the shutter, this comes down, it will catch the main cam here. When you fire, you bring up your shutter release, it lifts this away from the main cam and lets the shutter run down. So So that's good. So that brings us to the main cam and spring. Here's the main cam. I'm just going to lubricate that lightly with a bit of molybdenum paste. This big curved edge, I want the molybdenum paste on there, and on these two catch areas there really. That drops into position. We'll rotate that round to its stop. That brings us to the main spring. This one is looking a little bit healthier. Just lubricate that lightly with a bit of molybdenum paste. Get that in place. Make sure that the tail of the spring drops into the little hole on the arm of the main cam. And then I've got to hook that spring up over the top and around to the back of that arm there. It can be done. No. This is very easy with a tired, worn out spring and awkward with a good spring. Oh, that's just about it. I'm going to make sure that's hooked into the slot there. It is. Okay, so now if I cock this, release the shutter, it'll fire. That's good. I'm going to wipe a molybdenum paste on this surface of that arm so that as the cam comes round, it slides across it easily. That's good. Now it just needs my retard gear train and the self timer, which of course I haven't cleaned yet. I've just got to do these in Naphtha in the ultrasonic cleaner. I'll put the retard gear train in first, so I'll cock the shutter. Now the retard gear train and the self timer I have cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner in Naphtha and blown all the naphtha out, dried them out and lubricated both trains with graphite powder. I took the opportunity to straighten up the pin on the retard gear train. This pin here, that tracks the cam in the speed settings cam plate, and typically it's bent inwards or outwards for greater engagement so that the speed up or slow down the shutter to actually speed up. That pin had been bent, but instead of being bent along this axis, it had been bent over this way, so it was touching the side of the side of the frame at that point, and that would have adverse effects. It would probably stop this from coming all the way in, and so the slowest speeds probably didn't show up. I mean, the 1 second speed probably was slightly faster than that because this pin was rubbing on the body here and not dropping all the way in. Now whether that showed up as an effect with the shutter as it was, it's hard to say. We know that the spring was somewhat tired, it's likely that someone had adjusted the speeds to make the somewhat tired shutter work seemingly better. Anyway, so I've just got that speed train in. That sounds credible enough. Let's put the self-timer in now. Yeah, that's seated. There's a screw on the base of the self-timer that has to drop into a little socket or hole in the mechanism plate. That locates it effectively at this end, and then this end you've only got this screw. Okay, so set that, let it run down neatly. Well, it's certainly running. I wouldn't say it was running particularly smoothly. I haven't exercised this at all since I've run the graphite powder through it. I think that'll do. Now we'll cock the shutter. Set the self-timer. Let's see it fire the shutter. Well, it did the job, but I don't like it. I don't think it was smooth enough for my liking. It sounded a little bit sluggish to me. So I'm going to take that out and give it a thorough cleaning and put it back. The speed train, however, looks quite good. So I'll test my shutter speeds while I'm here. I'll just pop that cam in there. That little pinion, and set this in place. Get that timed correctly. Is that sticking? That's better. But this, I want to see what it's like at an 1/8 of a second. Oh, that's that self-timer's not in there. That sounded okay. Bit fast, if anything. Well, that's good. It's easy to adjust them to go slower. So what I'd need to do would be to swing the speed train inwards for greater engagement, and that I can certainly do. But in the meantime, I want to see if I can get this self-timer to run somewhat smoother than that.